Hello everyone and welcome to BHT Studios. This is my latest unboxing of the brand new Fujifilm X100V. But what you see here is my previous X100F. And I had a great time shooting with this. I actually wrote an article on Fujilove. I'll put the link down below, how I shot a pilot TV show, and Fujifilm was one of my sponsors, so thank you Fujifilm Canada. I've always had a lot of respect and affection for the X100 series, like many of you. I know guys that shoot DSLR digital who, for their own personal camera had an X100 series camera for themselves. And so now we got the latest, greatest X100V, which is the Roman numeral for 5. So X100S was the second generation, T was third, F, this one here is fourth, and now this is version number 5. There are tons of videos on the X100V. I was in Hong Kong at the time when this camera was being released, so I didn't get a copy till I got back. And then when I got back, I had tons of videos to do, so I thought I would do something a little bit different than the other YouTubers where, this is not a shooting experience. I have not even shot with this. This is an unboxing. And so let's just look at it. I brought other cameras with me to compare it against and sort of look at the features, and we'll see what happens. Capture One, can you believe it? I have not tried this yet, but a lot of people are singing praises, so I'm gonna have to give this a try. There is a free version as well as a paid version of this, and because this is Canada, you have, actually this is Spanish, so I don't know why it's Spanish. In Canada, you get the French as well as the English version, and it's always nice to get a printed copy of the manual, so you can just kind of keep it with you. How many of you guys download this and then put the PDF on your smartphone or whatever? I think it's better just have a paper copy. And ooh la la, this looks brand new. Before we, well, you know what? Let's just take this out here and let's look at it. And it does look untouched and new. And man, and I can't believe there's an articulating screen on here. I mean, if it is thicker, it's just, it does feel thicker. Anyways, let's just leave this aside for a second. Let's see what else we get in the box. You get the standard leather-like strap, which I think is okay. And we get a USB Type-C connector, and you don't get a charger, so that's probably how they want you to charge. And that's kind of become the trend. I'm not a fan of that trend, but that's just the way things roll. And then you get your battery here. So that's pretty much it. I don't care about anything else in the box. And so let's just leave that aside, put the battery in. Oh, look at that. That's different. What is that little, is that a lock? Okay, this is different. Look at how that opens and closes. That definitely is very different than the X100F. And I do have a, here we go. And this is the older X100T, which to me was, for me, the beginning of when I really liked it. The S was pretty darn good. I ended up getting the GR, the original GR APS-C one, so it's the GRV. But when this came out, I'm like, oh man, maybe I should have got this. But this is, I think, the same sort of battery compartment. And then now this completely changes to this newer version. Although the battery is the same as the F, but the X100T still used that thinner, older battery that was the same as the smaller camera bodies like the X70 and the X30. So let's just pop this battery in, and I don't think, not a fan of the bottom slot. It just feels cheaper. I wish that they would have put it in a side slot here. Like it's still, we'll go over the little things that always bothered me about the X100 series, but I always felt that the memory card should be on the side here for a more of a premium camera here. I've never been a fan of this. It feels premium, but it always feels like it's about to fall off. I always recommend to get that adapter and just put like regular lens caps on here. So here we go. Here are the two sort of the cameras that people will be wondering, if I have the F, should I upgrade to the new V? I kind of need the older version sort of to compare. In terms of thickness, Well, you could tell with the top here, you don't get that little notch on the far left side. It's more sort of very sharp edged, so it kind of has that iPad Pro, like the sharper lines, which is kind of that modern look. And as well, you could tell the line of that leatherette. See how it's misaligned on the X100F, which always bothered some people. And now it goes straight across, which aesthetically is way more pleasing. And as well as the grip here, it's changed a little bit there. The switch for the EVF, OVF has been moved up closer to where your thumb should be, so it's a little bit more ergonomic. Still have the front press button, which disappeared in the X Pro 3, which makes no sense, but it's still on the X100V, which is great. And what else has changed here? This switching mechanism feels very similar. It's definitely different. Everything feels a little bit tighter. It could just be because this camera is new, so this feels a bit tighter. Let's just see the top here. Even this exposure compensation dial feels different. It's a little bit clickier. Everything, it looks new. Like I don't see things coming directly. Even this on-off switch feels very different from the X100F. And of course, we know there's an all-new lens on here, although they did make sure that they kept the front, so you can use all the accessories from the previous camera, which is great that Fujifilm did that. So here, let's just look at this. Now, I guess one of the big things about this new X100V is the articulating screen, which I had mentioned previously when the GFX 50R got the articulating screen. The first thing I said was whenever they do something on the GFX series and it's kind of groundbreaking where they refuse to do it on the X series, it finds its way into the X series, like having a touch screen on a Pro body. They wouldn't do it. They would put it on the X70, but they wouldn't put it on the X-T2 and the X Pro 2. And as soon as they put it on the GFX 50S, then the X-T3 and the X-H1 got a touch screen. And so when the GFX 50R had this articulating screen, I knew that the X Pro 3, which is this one here, got an articulating screen, although they do have that controversial screen down. And there is actually a lot in common between the X Pro 3 and the X100V. One of them being, you could probably tell right away, is the viewfinder here, right? You're gonna have the exact same, the entire outer eye cup mechanism with the diopter on the side, exactly the same 3.69 million dot OLED EVF and the same hybrid sort of viewfinder system. You have actually the same, I think, 1.62 million dot LCD screen, touch LCD screen on the back. And even the button layout, it's very similar here. You could tell with the joystick, and then you have the menu button, and then you have the play button underneath, and then the display button down below as well. And we can look back at an older X100. You can see how they've really cleaned up the back. I always complained about the buttons being on the far left, meaning that you have to use two hands to operate this camera, because if you wanted to do certain, like switching view modes, you always have to use your second hand. This is all real right hand centric, and that was the same with the X100F. But of course, you can see the removal of the D-pad. Am I happy that it's gone? I wouldn't have minded if they had kept it, but since the XE3, I got used to there not being a D-pad, and then over time, I just kind of learned to work around there not being a D-pad. So if it was there, I wouldn't have complained. The swipe function on the touch screen is okay, but if you're wearing gloves, or if you got calloused fingers or anything like that, I think that having a dedicated four-way D-pad, having the custom functions is probably a better thing. But that's just sort of the design aesthetics of Fujifilm, including on the X Pro 3 not having that D-pad for this style of camera. The Q button is very, very flush. The previous model, a lot of people complained that It was easy to accidentally press it because of the sort of the thumb real estate here. This leatherette, this was sort of a limited edition. It has a kind of a nice grippy feel to it. One of the things that always kind of bugged me about the X100 series as well as the X Pro series is that this kind of weird fake leatherette, it's kind of slippery. The XT series always had a little bit more rubbery, kind of a little bit grippier, and this still has that weird kind of, it's leatherette-like, but it's still kind of slippery. And this brown version is a little bit grippier, so I actually got a pretty decent hold on the X100F. This one still feels a little too slippery, and there's not much thumb grip here, but this is not a really heavy camera either, so I don't think it's a big deal. Another major change, I should probably look at how messy this is. Another major change on this camera is when you're switching ISO, now instead of having to keep it pulled up, it stays locked up, which is really nice. I'm getting older and I wear contact lenses, and actually I wouldn't mind, you know, the little bubble on some of the Rolex and some of the higher end watches will have a little bubble on the date section. I still kind of struggle at times to see the ISO. So if you are like me and you still, even though it's easier to change ISO, you can put this to C continuous and then set in custom settings one of the dials to switch your ISO. But that's what I've done on the X Pro 3, and I am glad that they have this front, keep this command dial pressed down. See that on the front command dial? You can switch this to ISO, right? So now it's ISO, and you can see there that the ISO is switching, and now you don't even have to play with the top. And that's the one thing that kind of really didn't make sense to me on the X Pro 3, is they got rid of that front long press to switch this to, you know, either to aperture, shutter speed, or ISO or exposure compensation. I actually have to waste one of my custom function button, which is up here, so that I can toggle this between shutter speed and ISO and whatever else I want to do. So that's kind of one weird thing, as well as they removed the HDMI out on the X Pro 3, which, okay, fine. It makes sense that they're saying we don't want you to use this for video, but on the X100V, they still have the HDMI. So it may seem like an odd camera to use for video, but a lot of YouTubers have been saying, a lot of reviewers have been saying, and I'm excited to test this, is that this does video quite well. It has 4K, 200 megabits per second, and autofocus is supposed to be improved. That's the one thing I really wanted to check. Everyone's saying that the lens is much improved, and that's something that a lot of us have been waiting for. It's the same lens from the X100 to the S to the T to the F, and it was never a very sharp lens. It had a lot of character, and that's what I think a lot of people liked. And once you stop down, it sharpened up pretty good. For a street photographer with my X100F, I usually shot about f4 to f5.6 anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. And now even wide open at f2, this lens is very sharp. But one of the things I wanted to test was video. And so this has the same sensor, processor, as well as same sensor and processor as the X-T3, as the X-T30, and the X Pro 3. So in terms of image quality and a lot of the other features built in here, especially in the firmware, you're gonna get what the X Pro 3 have. You're gonna have it on the X100V, which is awesome. I am really looking forward to that. And when I shoot YouTube videos, including this one right now, I am shooting this with the f23 f2 lens. I find this is a really good focal length for shooting both sort of top-down video, but as well as shooting talking head. So I actually am going to test this using an external monitor, either using the Mars 400S external monitor, which I actually am using right now. I'll show you. I'm using my iPad to monitor this YouTube video, and I'm doing that just by doing HDMI out to a transmission unit, and then I'm watching what I'm doing just like right over here. And so I can do that using this X100V, which I cannot do with the X Pro 3. So that's the one thing I really think is awesome about this. Let's talk about sort of the aesthetics and ergonomics. So this has always been a pretty camera, right from the original X100 to the X100T, which, as I mentioned, I felt that it was a very competent camera and I highly recommended it. And notice even sort of the design aesthetics. It has the T here, but then when they went with the F, they didn't, you know, one of the things with the X Pro and the X100 series is from the front, there is no badging. You can't tell what it is until you look at it from the top, right? So from the front, they've always kept it very sort of stealth and discreet. And I think for design reasons, the design aesthetics, the language is very important to Fujifilm. There's been a lot of cases where some people say, you know, why can't you put this on the camera? And they would say, well, it would make it thicker or it would do this or that. Because they're really, really concerned about sort of that design language. And so putting an articulating screen on this camera until they can design it in a way where it, you know, like, you could barely tell it's articulating until you see this little notch here to pull this out. And so for the longest time, Fujifilm refused to put an articulating screen because they kept on saying it would make this too thick. And because of that, they refused to put it. Now that they've found a way to be able to put it on here without making it much thicker, that is the reason why Fujifilm put this on here. And if you look back, I'm going to show you some other older cameras they had. This is the X70, very popular camera. Really sad that they never made the X80, and the XF10 was really, or X10 or XF10 was really a downgrade. But one of the things that people really liked about the X70, because people were kind of deciding between the X70 and the X100, other than it having an 18mm or 28mm equivalent wide-angle lens, is this articulating screen, which is great for street photography. It stuck out pretty far, and it was cool because it actually did face forward, and I am surprised that Fujifilm has not sort of implemented this. It wouldn't have worked on the X100 because this camera is, you can sort of see how the articulating screen sticks out in the back. It's still a reasonably compact camera, and if you notice, that's what I have on the X100. They actually did keep the same threading on this camera as the X100, so I put the X70 hood from the X70 onto my X100F, and so that'll work actually on this one here. I can just thread this off and then put this on here. There you go, look at that. Look how cool this looks like that. And then grab this and it'll just thread right back on to my X100F right there. And so it's great that Fujifilm, again, cares a lot about design language as well as aesthetics. And so they made sure that even though it's an all new lens, that this thread stayed the same. But there is something that kind of is irritating, which is all the major connections. So you could tell there's parts of the internals that are still the same. Like maybe there's a part of the chassis, because I don't like the fact that these connections are on the right side, because if you're holding this camera and you actually want to use HDMI out and you put a monitor on here, well, the connection's over here, right? So as you're holding the camera, how are you gonna have HDMI out and connect? So same with this. All the connections, the USB Type-C, your microphone jack, as well as your USB, and also you can use the USB-C as a headphone output, but it's all on the side where your hand would be, and this door doesn't come off. And so this should be on this side. I don't think they purposely put it on here. I think going right back to the maybe even to the original X100, they always had all the connections on the far right side, and because of that, they just kind of continued the tradition because that's how the internal chassis works. So I'm a little disappointed. I do wish that this was over on this side, because it's kind of a waste of a side here. And if they do that, if they move all these plugs over to this side, the connections, then they could put the memory card, including a dual card slot. Well, you know what, actually, looking at this, the battery's here, the card slot is here, so definitely it would be really to the far back, but I think they could still fit a card slot in back here if they moved all this over. So that's kind of one of my complaints. It's not a huge complaint. And another camera I wanted to share with you is it's kind of another lost gem, is the X30. Now this was not a very popular camera because at the time this came out, it was kind of at the time with the RX100 from Sony, as well as the Canon the G5X, G7X was out, and this had a smaller 2/3 sensor, but I think it actually still was being built by Fujifilm when they still had their own sensor factory. And this was this actually had a pretty good 2.36 million dot EVF, which is what the X100F has. So it doesn't have a hybrid viewfinder. It's not a true rangefinder, but it's in a rangefinder format. But it was compact. It turns on by turning this on. It had a 28 to 112 zoom lens. You just turn it off by switching like that. It has a filter thread, pop-up flash, and it had an articulating screen. Now it is chunky because it had an articulating screen, but this is a really nice, compact little camera, and it did share battery with the X70 and the X100T. So to me, this so here's these cameras here: the X100F, the X30, the X70, and the X100T, and this kind of merges all of these with the X Pro 3, with a lot of the X Pro 3, same sensor, same processor, same the hybrid EVF OVF, same not the same articulation, but the same LCD screen, 3-inch, 1.62 million dot, and in terms of the internals, the same firmware, pretty much the same firmware, very similar video features, but it seems like with the front button press here, I'm looking at the X Pro 3, in terms of custom function ability, this camera, because of the front dial that has a button here, it has more. I'm just looking. Oh, sorry, this is not even the right one here. The X Pro 3. Let's look at the button layout here. It feels like you can pretty much have more custom functions on the X100V. So I wouldn't say better video features, but it has the HDMI out, which is a big deal for me. I'm going to test that. And one of the things I really want to test, as I mentioned before, is autofocus speed. Is this good enough to shoot video? Because I did try shooting video on the X100F, and quite a few of my YouTube videos, I actually did use this, but I had to set defocus to manual. And that's actually not great, because if you turn the camera on and off, the focus distance shifts, because this is not a manual, like this is an electronic focus by wire camera. And that's the one thing I'm not a big fan of. But if the autofocus is good enough on this, then I would just use autofocus for this and actually shoot YouTube videos, both top down. And if I'm doing top down, I'm using this monitor system, so it goes like this, so I can actually shoot video top down this way, like this, and still be able to see what's happening down below, including shooting stills. If you're doing sort of flat lay type pictures, you can do flat lay pictures like this. And so I'm going to test autofocus, I'm going to test video features, I'm going to test a lot of things on this camera. I'm really excited about the X100V. So there we go, comparing again the two F and the V. So one of the questions people may ask is, I have this camera, should I get the X100V as an upgrade? I say it's more about the firmware and not so much the hardware. Yes, it's the sharper lens, but if you had the X100F and you're happy, you've always been happy with the IQ, a sharper lens won't make a huge difference. But I think there's a big leap in the processor, leaping from the X Processor Pro, which is the third iteration, to the X Processor 4. A lot of firmware updates, including new film simulations in here and new algorithms, better video, better autofocus, better pretty much everything of the internals. And so having the articulating screen without it being in your way, you might say, well, I never use it. Well, then just don't use it. And so it's a prettier looking camera. I think doing subtle design changes is a good thing. Having the improved EVF, OVF, all these little things, I think, sort of add up to a overall better camera. And Fujifilm has done that with every iteration of the X100, with maybe the exception of going from the X100 to the X100S. That was probably the least reason to upgrade. And the S to the T was pretty good. T to the F was a pretty good reason to switch over, especially with the bigger battery. And then now from the F over to the new V, I think again the big leap is really the processor, as well as the new lens, as well as the articulating screen, with minus the loss of the D-pad. That's how you're used to shooting. I will say though that one of the controversies about this camera is about weatherproofing. That's something that we've been asking for years in Fujifilm. And so you do have to get a filter, or I mean, I think you could do something like this and have it reasonably weather sealed. But you know, to make it more weather sealed, you do have to get the adapter that you put on here, and then you get the filter thread, and then you can put a filter on here. Although there is a filter thread in here, if you use something like this, this front half does come off here like that. And you can also put a filter here because the lens does move in and out, and that's what keeps it from being weather sealed. But it's not just here that's weather sealed, right? Everything else on the body has also been weather sealed, which would include the doors. There should be some kind of weather sealing in here, as well as on the inside of the connection here. I don't see anything, but they do claim that the body is also weather sealed, but to get it fully weather sealed, you can get that filter, and now you have that full weather sealing. For those who don't want that, to maintain this thinner sort of profile, as well as being able to put the accessory lenses on here, as well as the accessory hoods, you know, you have that option. But again, as I was mentioning, Fujifilm is very conscious of aesthetics as well as sort of design language. And I guess for them, they felt that putting a piece of glass standard on here to keep it weather sealed, they just really didn't want to do that. So it's not a big deal. The filter is not that expensive. I have a feeling that you don't even need to use Fujifilm's filter. You can put like a B+W or Heliopan or a really high-end premium filter, and that'll just sort of seal up the camera really nicely. For me personally, I think I will just put this hood on the front. Although if you put the filter on, it's not just about weather sealing, it's also your sort of dust proofing as well. So maybe it's a good idea if you are going in inclement weather, meaning it's cold, it's rainy, it's humid, it's dusty, to put that filter in the front, because as it's moving in and out, it's probably sucking in dust into the system. So, but having everything else weather sealed, probably including the eye cup and this whole mech here, that you're not going to get dust in the viewfinder, which is great. So that's my first impressions. Oh, another point maybe is the $1,400 price point worth it for the X100V? Because, you know, you can get an X-T30 for I think about $800, and if you get that with the 23f2 lens, so X-T30 with the 23f2 lens, same sensor, same processor as this camera, but a different firmware, including a lot of the extra features you got on the X Pro 3, which is having the focus limiter, having the new film profiles and things like that. But even with that, I think you're about $150 cheaper with the X-T30 and the XF23f2. But I would argue, and I would assume, that this lens is going to be sharper than the 23f2, which I'm actually using right now to shoot this video. For another, so this the X Pro 3, if you got just the kind of the standard black, I think you know, like, it's $1,400 is still quite expensive, but getting an all-in-one package camera, I think you are paying a premium. One thing that a lot of photographers don't mention is this is a leaf shutter. So the top shutter speed is 1/4000th of a second. Unless you go into electronic shutter, you do have a built-in mechanical neutral density filter, which only works for stills. I did mention to Fujifilm, please add it to the video since the video features are really good. So hopefully on a firmware update, they'll do that. There's been fans of this camera from non-Fuji shooters. As I mentioned before, Canon, Nikon, DSLR shooters. For the personal camera, they will buy this, and I think for $1,400, considering all-in-one compact point-and-shoot type cameras with a leaf shutter, so 1/4000th of a second top shutter speed, and then flash sync throughout the entire range, because cameras like this, flash sync is only up to 1/250th of a second using a standard flash, and this goes up to 1/4000. So if you're doing daylight flash, which maybe I'll do some test shots, because I've done that before with the Leica Q and other cameras like that has a leaf shutter, and that makes this super quiet and stealthy to shoot with. One last thing I actually wanted to mention about the X100V. I was somewhat disappointed, but kind of in a weird way, because when the X Pro 3 came out and they came out with this weird articulating screen, they came out with a titanium top, it was so weird and quirky that I thought it was a pretty darn good idea. I mean, this is made in Japan. they know it's the premium camera. It's not going to sell as well as their XT series or the XE series or anything like that. But you know, they made some bold decisions. You know, as Apple famously said when they took out the headphone jack, that it took courage to do that. I think this took real courage to remove some features. To me, I actually would have been more excited if the X100V was also made out of titanium top and bottom, and if they also put this weird articulating screen on the back of the X100V, so you could, like the X Pro 3, throw it in your camera bag and not really worry about getting scratches other than scratches on this screen here, which is not a vital screen. And you could always get a little kind of a screen protector on here, but you just feel a lot safer with this closed. And with X100V, if it had a screen like this, it would also force you to kind of really spend time and money, you know, the time and money spent on developing this EVF, hybrid EVF, OVF, which OVF is great for street photography, so you can see outside the frame lines, and I think that's one of the greatest strengths of using the X100, the X Pro series and the X100 series is if you're on the street shooting and you want to see outside the frame lines without having to not look at the LCD screen, so you look into the viewfinder, other than you being in sport mode, which crops the image, which is not a huge deal, but in OVF you can do that, and I really like shooting that way with the X Pro 3, and so I would have been happier personally if you mean, look how cool the X Pro 3 looks. If they had the X100V titanium top with a hidden LCD, but I know I'm in the minority. I think for most people, they're super happy that they have an articulating screen. That's the normal style, which is kind of just the two-way articulation. Like I said, the one negative about this camera, which is not really a negative, is it has a really mainstream appeal, and I don't see anyone really being offended by this camera, other than maybe having to buy a filter to make this a fully weather sealed. So this back is all weather sealed, and then just for that little lens opening here, you need that filter to do so. But this is a non-offensive camera. Oh, and also the removal of the D-pad. But other than that, which since the XE3, Fujifilm has been doing that with their rangefinder style cameras, is just removing the D-pad because it's more about aesthetics and having less buttons and more focusing on shooting. And so other than that and the filter, I mean, this is an inoffensive camera. I think all the decisions that were made really has a mass appeal, and that's kind of the thing that loses a little bit of sparkle for me. Even though I am excited about it, I still really love the X Pro 3 and the titanium top and the weird LCD screen, but they're both great cameras, and again, I can't wait to start shooting with this. If autofocus is up to where they say it is, then I think I'm going to upgrade to the X100V. So this is my first look at the Fujifilm X100V. Look for my my first shooting impressions on this camera, and then hopefully I can get a long-term copy and let you know what I think overall. But so far, I am pretty excited to test this camera. So thank you so much for watching, guys. We'll talk to you soon, and happy shooting. Click, click. Peace.